The shadows of history are long and dark, but few figures have cast one as chilling as Rodney James Alcala. A predator in disguise, he moved unnoticed through the world, a charming photographer with an unsettling smile, a man who seemed ordinary but carried death in his wake. Behind his lens, behind his eyes, lurked a monster. Born Rodrigo Jacques Alcala on August 23, 1943, in San Antonio, Texas, he was abandoned by his father as a child and moved with his mother to Los Angeles. He excelled in school, an intelligent and popular young man, but something festered beneath the surface. At 17, he joined the United States Army, but was discharged 3 years later after being diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. A psychiatrist would later describe him as possessing malignant narcissism, an unsettling mix of charm, intelligence, and complete lack of empathy. By the late 1960s, his crimes had begun. On September 25, 1968, a motorist saw Alcala luring an 8-year-old girl named Tali Shapiro into his apartment. Sensing something was wrong, the man called the police. Officers arrived to a gruesome scene. Shapiro lay on the floor, battered and barely alive. Blood pooled beneath her small frame, the steel bar he had used to bludgeon her still lying nearby. But Alcala was gone. He had vanished into the shadows, leaving only horror behind. With an arrest warrant hanging over him, Alcala fled to the East Coast and enrolled at New York University under the alias John Berger. There, he studied under Roman Polanski, the acclaimed filmmaker, an irony too dark to ignore. He blended in seamlessly, a man hiding in plain sight. In June 1971, he struck again. 23-year-old flight attendant Cornelia Crilly was found raped and strangled in her Manhattan apartment, a pair of nylon stockings twisted around her throat. The case went cold for decades. In Los Angeles, he resumed his depraved spree, moving through the city unnoticed, his camera a tool of manipulation. He convinced women to pose for him, promising them beauty, capturing them in his frame. But many of those images became the last records of their lives. He was a hunter, and his prey never saw him coming. The true horror of Alcala's sadism lay in his cruelty. He did not simply kill, he played with his victims, torturing them in ways that made even hardened investigators shudder. He strangled them until they lost consciousness, then revived them, only to repeat the process again and again. He drew out their suffering, prolonging the inevitable, savoring their fear. Then came 1978, the year his name would become infamous for a different reason. That year, he auditioned for The Dating Game, a popular television show where contestants vied for a date with an eligible bachelorette. Under the bright studio lights, dressed in a beige suit, Alcala was introduced to the audience as a successful photographer who liked skydiving and motorcycling. He laughed, flirted, and charmed the audience, his mask of normalcy firmly in place. He won the contest, but something about him felt wrong. The bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, later recalled getting an eerie feeling, a deep unease that made her cancel the date. He was creepy, she said. She had unknowingly escaped a serial killer. By 1979, Alcala had killed at least 5 women in California alone. His downfall began when 12-year-old Robin Samso disappeared while riding her bicycle to ballet class. Her body was discovered 12 days later in the foothills outside Los Angeles. Witnesses reported a man with a camera approaching young girls on the beach that day. A composite sketch was drawn, and Alcala's parole officer recognized him instantly. His face, the same face that had once smiled on television, was plastered across police bulletins. He was arrested in July 1979. inside his Seattle storage locker, detectives found a nightmare waiting for them. Over 1,000 photographs of women, teenage girls, and young boys, many in sexually explicit poses. Some of them had been murdered. Some were never identified. The question loomed: how many more had he killed? His trial was a spectacle of madness. In 2010, facing 5 murder charges, Alcala chose to represent himself. What followed was bizarre. He played both lawyer and witness, questioning himself in a deeper voice before answering in his normal tone. He showed the jury clips of his dating game appearance as evidence. He rambled, mocked the court, and showed no remorse. When asked about the murders, he simply said he couldn't remember committing them. The jury saw through his performance. He was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. But even behind bars, his crimes continued to haunt investigators. DNA evidence linked him to 2 more murders in New York: the 1971 killing of Cornelia Crilly and the 1977 murder of Ellen Hover, a young woman whose datebook contained a chilling entry, John Berger. The true extent of his crimes may never be known. Authorities believe he could have murdered up to 130 people, his victims scattered across the country, their faces frozen in the photos he left behind. The images are still out there, a silent plea for answers. In 2016, one such photo led to another charge: the murder of Christine Ruth Thornton, who had been 6 months pregnant when she vanished in 1977. Rodney Alcala died in prison on July 24, 2021, at the age of 77. He never admitted to the full scale of his crimes. He never revealed the names of all his victims. He took their secrets with him to the grave, leaving behind a legacy of fear and unanswered questions. There are names in history that chill the blood, and Charles Carl Panzram is one of the most harrowing of them all. His story is not one of a man born with a predisposition for evil, but rather a product of a tortured existence, a life spiraling through unspeakable acts of violence, rage, and hatred. He was a serial killer, a rapist, an arsonist, a thief. His crimes a relentless progression of savagery that consumed everything in its path. His words, written in the bleakest corners of his mind, serve as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can take root in the human soul. Born on June 28, 1891, near East Grand Forks, Minnesota, Panzram's early life was far from ordinary. He was the 6th of 7 children in a household ruled by cruelty. His parents, East Prussian immigrants, were strict and unforgiving, pushing their children into grueling labor on the family farm. Sleep was a luxury he could hardly afford, for after long hours working in the fields, he was forced to attend school with barely a moment to rest. Punishments were harsh and affection was absent. As a young child, Panzram would quickly learn to fend for himself, stealing food and lying to survive. It wasn't long before his father abandoned the family, when Carl was just 7 years old, leaving him with a deep sense of abandonment and resentment. By the time he was 8, he had already been arrested for drunkenness, setting the stage for a life that would spiral violently out of control. As a teenager, Panzram's encounters with the law grew increasingly frequent. At just 11 years old, he was already being labeled incorrigible, a term that would haunt him for the rest of his life. By his early teens, he had developed a taste for crime, stealing whatever he could, from cake and apples to firearms. But it was his time at the Minnesota State Training School, a so-called reform school, that would solidify his path to destruction. It was there, in the shadows of institutional brutality, that he was subjected to beatings, torture, and rape, by the very staff meant to rehabilitate him. A rage began to build within him, and in 1905, he set fire to the school in a symbolic act of rebellion, though it was only the beginning of his violent journey. From that point on, Panzram's life was a relentless barrage of criminal acts: burglary, robbery, arson, and violence. He was a man who had no place in society, no desire to fit in. He became a drifter, traveling from state to state, his crimes escalating with each new location. At the age of 14, he attempted to kill a Lutheran clergyman, and within a few years, he was arrested for a series of burglaries. His time in various jails and prisons became a cycle of violent rebellion, where Panzram's hatred of authority and society grew ever stronger. He attacked guards, broke out of prisons, and left a trail of destruction in his wake. By 1911, Panzram had grown increasingly vicious, a man hardened by his experiences. It was during this time that he began his most chilling crimes. Using various aliases, he murdered with cold precision. His killings, many of them carried out with firearms, seemed almost random, a reflection of the deep chaos within his mind. But they were not without pattern. Panzram's murders were often accompanied by brutal acts of sexual violence. He would lure men onto his boat, get them drunk, and then take their lives. The bodies of these men were often discarded into the sea, their identities erased by the waves. He claimed to have killed 10 sailors in this manner, though the true toll of his victims may never be known. Panzram's murderous spree extended far beyond the United States. After fleeing to Angola in 1921, he continued his reign of terror, killing without remorse. He confessed to raping and murdering children in Africa, even boasting of his atrocities in his writings. His mind, twisted by years of torment and isolation, had no room for empathy or guilt. His acts were simply an extension of his overwhelming hatred of humanity. By the time he returned to the United States, Panzram was a fugitive of the highest order, wanted for countless crimes, including the brutal murder of a prison employee. His final capture came in 1928, after a burglary in Washington, D.C. He had already confessed to killing 3 young boys in the span of just a few months, but it was his time in Leavenworth prison that would seal his fate. While working in the prison laundry, Panzram was assigned to work under a man named Robert Warnke. Warnke's cruel treatment would prove to be his undoing. On June 20th, 1929, Panzram brutally murdered Warnke with an iron bar, an act that would lead to his conviction and eventual execution. The final years of Panzram's life were spent behind bars, where he became notorious not only for his crimes, but for his chilling, nihilistic philosophy. A man completely devoid of remorse, he wrote at length about his life of crime, stating, "I have no conscience, so that does not worry me." He saw himself as a man beyond redemption, a creature forged in the flames of abuse and hatred. He mocked those who tried to intervene on his behalf, writing with venom, "The only thanks you and your kind will ever get from me for your efforts on my behalf is that I wish you all had one neck and that I had my hands on it." On September 5th, 1930, Panzram was executed by hanging. As the noose was placed around his neck, he spat in the face of the executioner, his final act of defiance. When asked if he had any last words, Panzram's response was chillingly blunt. "Yes. Hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." The legacy of Panzram is not one of redemption, but a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the human soul. And in his wake, there remains a question. How many others like him, hiding in the shadows, are still out there, waiting for the world to break them, just as it broke him?